well, and as far as they can do, Miss Sue's doing good. But I needed to preach tonight for that reason. I showed Emily some sermons of old sermons I could remember, and I asked her to pick one. And she said, "That one looks fun." I think as well, the kids are doing Genesis right now. So all the children, 3rd grade and under, or 2nd grade and under, are doing Genesis right now. So they've just recently done this story. So maybe I'd have some little ones' attentions if I talked about the Tower of Babel. If you have your Bible, you can turn to Genesis 10. This is a chapter that we usually skipped. And I presented this sermon, I think back in 2021. And we had recently done Genesis in the large auditorium in the adult classes. Genesis 10 is a list of names. Noah has survived the flood with his family on the ark by God's grace. And his 3 sons and their 3 wives have all left the ark. They've made a sacrifice to God, and God's made a covenant with them. And the first part of that covenant is be fruitful and multiply and dominate the earth. When we get to chapter 10, we learn the descendants of Noah's family. And again, it's this long list of names. Sometimes we get to a long list of names, we like to skip it. But I think there's something we can do with these long lists of names that prepares us for chapter 11 when we read about the story of the Tower of Babel. If I kind of outline chapter 10 so we don't have to just read it for what it is, we basically get the family of Noah. And as y'all know, as I've already said, Noah had 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Shem is the one we usually care about because Shem is the ancestor of Abraham. But he goes on to explain what happened with his other sons, Japheth and Ham. He starts here with Japheth. In verse 2, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Medea, and that's as far as I'm going to read when it comes to those names. There's people today that try to make arguments about, hey, that word Gomer is a German word. Very well may be Japheth is the father of all Germans from the Gomer family. I don't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. I don't know what to do with that. What I really want about Japheth is here in verse 5, how Moses concludes Japheth's genealogy. Verse 5 says, "From these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to the families into their nations." He says that Japheth is the Gentiles of the coastlands. And so when we're going to conclude with this similar thought of Noah's prophecy about Japheth. But Noah said that Japheth would become very large, and Moses said that these are the Gentiles that live around the water. So I imagine, and I think this is the simplest way to do it, is that if you don't live in the Middle East, your father's probably Japheth. That's how you're related to him, If you're a Gentile, you're probably related to Japheth somehow. And that's the way that Moses handles the Japheth line. But obviously, chapter 10 focuses more on these 2 sons, Ham and Shem. Verse 6, the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Very well may be, Cush might be the father of the Ethiopians. Mizraim, and I'm a little bit more confident about this because it's also used in Genesis, Mizraim is probably the founder of Egypt. And so the Egyptians here are represented. Later he tells us that also the Philistines came from the family of Mizraim. But we know that 4th name there, that 4th son's name was Canaan. And Canaan was the founder of, you guessed it, the Canaanites. And so much of the conquest period of the Old Testament is about the Canaanites and the Canaan land. Well, this was their founder, or their originer, is Ham's descendant, Canaan. Moses doesn't focus on Canaan here. Instead, in verse 8, he focuses on Cush, because Cush has Noah's great-grandson here, Nimrod. Nimrod, in verse 8, he began to be a mighty one of the earth. He was mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, as it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. I think that's the same as Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Go ahead and give you a heads up. What's going to happen in the land of Shinar? Well, that's where he's going to say the Tower of Babel was built. After that, in verse 11, then from that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh. And we're familiar with the city Nineveh. That's the nation that took the northern nation of Israel into captivity. So Nimrod is associated with these very wicked cities. If you read Josephus, which you really shouldn't, but if you did, Josephus explains the Jewish perception of this chapter in book 1. And Josephus says that the Jews in the first century believed Nimrod to be an evil, wicked man. And even though it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, apparently the Jews interpret that as that he was just a very powerful figure. And because he was such a powerful figure, he produced these very wicked cities. Josephus even goes so far as say that Nimrod is the founder of the Tower of Babel, that it was his idea. It very well could have been, but that's at least the Jewish perception of this verse. I can't be so bold to make those claims and just stand on them because Moses doesn't specifically say it. The other thing I need to bring up about Nimrod is in my mind the elephant of the room. How do we all know the name Nimrod? Well, maybe some of us are like, well, I know about it from Bible class. But a lot of us know it because we've heard Nimrod said by Bugs Bunny. And if y'all remember, Bugs Bunny would often call who? You Nimrod. Well, he would call Elmer Fudd, you Nimrod. And why would Bugs Bunny call Elmer Fudd, you Nimrod? Because Elmer Fudd was a mighty hunter. And that was the joke. But today, what has Nimrod turned into in our vernacular in English? Well, it means now, you fool, you Nimrod. That's not from the Bible. That's from Bugs Bunny trying to make a joke about the Bible. But let's face it, a lot of Americans watching Bugs Bunny didn't know enough about the Bible to understand the joke. So they thought that joke was you fool, right? And that's where the word Nimrod has come into vernacular. It does not mean fool here. Here, Nimrod is a very powerful figure that was a descendant of Cain. A descendant of Ham. Noah's other son, Shem, is the one who has Abraham. Here, Shem is mentioned in verse 21. And children were born also to Shem, the father of the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxadad, Lud, and Aram. There, we're familiar with those terms in other places. Arphaxadad is the one that has ultimately Abraham. And of course, Abraham's story begins in chapter 12. Now, after we read all those names, what's fun to do with it is to take an ancient map and look at those names and see what cities are named after these same men that Moses mentions here in chapter 10. Maybe we all can't see this list, but these things will kind of help. I got some pictures up here that kind of help us go through it. Japheth, where is his descendants on this map? Well, in verse 5, Moses told us where Japheth's descendants went. Japheth's descendants went out. They're not on this list. And it seems like none of Japheth's descendants tried to settle in the Fertile Crescent or in the land of Shinar, as they called it here. They all went out. And that's where all those Gentiles come from. But Ham's descendants, many of the list here in Moses, is also named here in this map and in Genesis chapter 10. And there's some names here, especially names of cities that Nimrod founded. There's cities like Akkad. Akkad, we'll talk about that later, but Akkad is a very famous city and probably the first capital city of the first empire that we know about in the world. There are cities like Uruk, and if you can see this map, you see it spelled differently. On the map, it's spelled U-R-U-K. In here, Moses, I know it wasn't Moses, it was our translators, spells it E-R-E-C-K. Also with Akkad, sometimes Akkad is spelled A-K-K-A-D, but maybe in your account of Genesis, it's spelled A-C-C-A-D. I'm just going to say this once and move on. In the ancient world, spelling doesn't matter because there is no such thing as English yet. So if phonetically it works, phonetically that's what it is. And that's how they just handle that. No, you can't tell your English teachers that my preacher said spelling doesn't matter. But at least in terms of the ancient world, spelling did not matter. Whatever phonetically worked is why those names are there. There's also cities of Ham, like Nineveh. We know about Nineveh, and there's Nineveh, right? Obviously, the Canaanites lived here that were descendants of Ham. And finally, we have places like Gersu there would all have been descendants of Ham. And now these cities share the same names. But of course, it's not just Ham that lives here. As well, Shem lives here in this area. And here's some places that we know would have had Shemites living in. The one we need to remember the most here is Ur. Why do I know that Ur has Shem descendants living there? Because that is Abraham's hometown. And if Abraham and his family are from Ur, well, certainly Shemites have made up the land of Ur. And that's why that city-state is there. As well as Asher up here. Asher is the same name as a descendant of Shem, and so is Elam, is also a descendant of Shem. We know Elam to be a principal city in Persia. Seems like the Persians and the Assyrians all descended from Shem. And so now what do we have here basically? And if you didn't follow all that, that's okay. Let's just take the big point right here. Who stayed in the Middle East? Shem and Ham stayed in the Middle East. Who left like they were supposed to? The people of Japheth left like they were supposed to. And that's all we need from chapter 10 to be able to move into chapter 11. Here, let's talk about sources for the period other than what the one Moses just provided for us. Because obviously, the only source I really know about to explain, and this is a map of the Akkadian Empire, we'll talk about the Akkadian Empire in just a second, is what Moses told us here in this account. Moses wasn't alive when he told about this account. He lived 1,000 years after the fact when he told us this account. But the reason why the people believed Moses about the account is because they had seen the miracles that Moses had done. And if Moses can part the Red Sea, well, if he tells me about some guy named Nimrod, I'm going to be inclined to believe him, right? If he tells me about some guy named Noah, I'm inclined to believe Moses because I've seen the miracles that God has worked through Moses, right? So Moses tells us the account of Nimrod and how he built Akkad and how he built Uruk. He also told us about Abraham of Ur. And so I believe Moses because of those things. Now, as well, we have people like Sargon the Great. Sargon the Great is not mentioned in the Bible, but is also a person that would have lived during this time period. The only reason why we know about Sargon the Great is because of actually Nebuchadnezzar, like our Nebuchadnezzar that invaded Israel from Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar spent resources to try to find out more about Sargon the Great, and he collected things about Sargon the Great that he found at his home. And now we know about Sargon the Great because Nebuchadnezzar preserved these things for us. Sargon the Great was known as the first emperor, and his capital city was Akkad, and we call it the Akkadian Empire. That's all I can really say about Sargon the Great, but he was someone that would have been there sometime after the time of Nimrod. As well, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is also a story of around this time period. Gilgamesh in the story is from Uruk, which is one of those towns that would have been one of the descendants of Ham. He's from a place where Nimrod's from, basically. In the 1800s, the British discovered Nineveh. And I know that's weird to think about, but there was a time in the world, in the Western world, where there was a lot of people that did not believe Nineveh was a real place. They believed it was sort of like a biblical myth. Well, in the 1800s, the British found Nineveh, and it was buried in sand, just like the prophet said it was. And when they uncovered Nineveh, they also found these very large clay tablets that told the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. They hired a man named George Smith to translate the tablets. And if you want to read about George Smith on the internet, his life was fantastic. He was a self-trained linguist, and he only died in his 30s. He didn't live very long. But George Smith was paid to take the Epic of Gilgamesh and translate it for the British. He translates it, and in 1870s, he presented his findings. And he had this really big event. A lot of people were there, and he was going to present a part of what he's translated from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was such a big deal, even the British Prime Minister was in attendance, and he was there for all of this. George Smith picked one part from the Epic of Gilgamesh that he wanted to share, and it's a very important part. In the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is after eternal life because his friend has died, and he's trying to figure out how he can rejoin his friend in eternal life. And so what someone suggests Gilgamesh does is he goes and finds what they call the immortal man. And he said the immortal man has lived much longer than the rest of us. Go visit the immortal man and he will tell you how he has lived so long. And so Gilgamesh goes and talks to the immortal man. The immortal man explains that he's lived a very long time and something very crazy happened to him many years before Gilgamesh was born. What's neat about it, when George Smith translated, is everybody was familiar with this next part, even though it was in clay tablets that no one had read for 2,000 years, really maybe 3,000 years. And he says that the immortal man explains that the gods became very angry and they decided they were going to flood the entire world. So the immortal man built this giant barge and he collected all of the animals 2 by 2, male and female, and he saved this from this great gigantic flood that took over the whole earth. The immortal man even goes to say that when the flood waters began receding, to figure out whether it was dry land or not, he began getting birds out of his barge and letting the birds go to see if they would come back or not. Eventually the birds did not come back, and that's when the immortal man knew that it was okay to go outside of his barge. Now, what happened there when George Smith presented the findings? Well, everybody got excited. Not necessarily all for the right reasons, but everybody was happy. The believers said, look, we told you this was a real story. Noah was a real person, and this is another account of Noah and the flood. And all the non-believers said, look, we told you. Moses just got it from this guy. So again, it's never really about the evidence, is it? It's about the choices you make, and everybody was going to choose what they had already chosen long before the evidence was presented. But regardless, it's another account of the flood, and it's very similar. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh and then we read Moses' story, this is why Moses' story, I think, is more special. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the immortal man is able to save all the land animals because he outsmarts the gods. He's clever, and because of his cleverness, he's rewarded. But in Moses' account of Noah, why is Noah saved? In Moses' account, Noah is saved not because he outsmarts God, but because he found grace in the eyes of God. And it's almost like Moses is setting the record straight. He's saying, look, Noah didn't outsmart God. Noah and God cared about each other, and God rescued Noah by telling him to create that ark. So obviously a story they all knew, but this was another version of it. And I'd like to end that kind of thought with this right here. But which story survived? You know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that story got buried. And we've only recently rediscovered it in the 1870s. But was Moses' story buried? No, Moses' story got passed down because the ancients deemed that story to be more important. But what did they do with the Epic of Gilgamesh? They buried it, right? So even the ancients considered Moses' story to be more important. And we should consider it too. Maybe the last thing I could say is, regardless, if Gilgamesh was a real person, I certainly believe Sargon was a real person. Some people say they are Nimrod. They're the same person. But I think we could at least say these people are at least related to Nimrod, or maybe be descendants of Nimrod. And that's how we can kind of squeeze all these stories together into this one time period. Ultimately, in the land of Shinar, even today, there's ziggurats. And ziggurats are just temples that are supposed to reach to the sky. They're all through the Babylon, Iraq, Iran area. This is the one in Ur. And what's interesting about the ziggurat here in Ur is that this is the very thing that Abraham would have seen every day on the way to work. Like, that's it. That's the ziggurat. So Abraham knew full well what this looked like, and I'm sure he knew about the pagan things going on in there. And I almost picture that every day Abraham is in Ur and he's walking by the ziggurat. What is God telling him? Well, we know what God's telling him. It's in chapter 12, right? Chapter 12, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Abram, or had been saying to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Abraham grew up in Nimrod's country. Abraham grew up amongst the Tower of Babel. And what is God had been telling him, obviously for a while? Abraham, get out of this country. Go to a land that I have showed you. And I'll be able to do these things for you, Abraham, but I need you to get out of this country. And ultimately, Abraham did get out of this country. And God was able to fulfill the promises he made to Abraham away from that ziggurat, right? So if that's a big explanation of chapter 10 and all the other sources we have about chapter 10, well, then we need to talk about chapter 11. Because chapter 11 is where the Tower of Babel happens. And it's not a lot of verses. Let's read the whole thing together. And we'll use sort of this graph to put the story together. In chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "Now the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They had brick for stone, they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.' But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, 'Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore the name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth." Well, here in verse 1, evidently those living in the land of Shinar decided it would be good for them to make a giant city. And what was the purpose of that giant city? Well, it was supposed to be a kingdom to reach heaven. That was the idea of the city. And I know we could go so many different directions. I've heard people read it and say, well, they were trying to build a city that could escape the flood. That was the idea. Sure, I'm okay with that. Or some people are like, no, they're just trying to build a giant city because it would be awesome. I'd be okay with that as well. And of course, with all the ziggurats, those little pyramids all over that area, you would think that they had already building them. And whoever is here is saying, hey, why don't we build the biggest one? And we could all live in it together and everyone would know that we built the biggest one. That might as well be it as too. I'm okay with any of those answers. Regardless, they're trying to build a kingdom to reach heaven. And that's the idea. That's what they're pushing. Who was the founder of this? Now, again, we can't say for sure, but if Nimrod founded all these cities in the land of Shinar, and it even mentions that Nimrod founded Babel, and then at the end of this story it says this place is called Babel, you would think that maybe Nimrod had something to do with this. And it may be that he wasn't directly involved. He may have been indirectly involved, but regardless, his name is associated with the city of Babel. And the way Josephus talks about it, it's almost like Nimrod is an anti-Abraham, that a great kingdom was trying to be built, that he was founded on him. But of course, as we know, it doesn't work. Who's the builder of the Tower of Babel? Well, it's man. It's all man's idea, and it's all man's plans. And even Moses mentions that they say to one another, come, let us bake bricks. Let's build this city, right? And they're over there making the bricks long before they even start laying the city because they know we're going to need a lot of bricks. And they're working hard to build this wonderful giant city. What was their desire to build this kingdom to reach heaven? Well, verse 4 says it pretty plainly. They wanted to make a name for themselves, right? Which makes me believe there's other tribes of people running around that are not participating in the Tower of Babel. And they want those people to see that they've been dominated by what they've been able to build. They want to make a name for themselves. They only have their own interest in heart here in verse 4. And of course, what was their language? Well, they were all of one language. And of course, usually when we use the Tower of Babel story, we just use it as a way to explain this is why we have so many different languages. That maybe we used to have one language when we all lived on the ark, but God had to do something where he split up our languages, and that's why we have all the languages we have today. And of course, we can't answer that here with the Tower of Babel, but let's just make this point. They all spoke one language, but for God to end their city and to end the construction, the Lord changed their language, verse 9. And that's sort of the miracle of the story. The Lord came down, he saw what they were doing, he said, let us confuse their language so we can stop this process. And the Lord successfully stopped the process by just confusing their language. Whew. Is it hard to talk to someone that can't speak English? It's very what are you going to do? It's incredibly difficult, right? Is it hard also for that person to understand you when they can't speak your language? Yeah, they would say the same thing. They would go, I can't understand what he's saying. Is it incredibly difficult to work with someone that's not speaking the same language than you? And it's almost like this whole giant process, no matter how smart they were and how much they already had all planned out, the construction project was over because there was nothing that they could do to work together anymore. What about in terms of unity? Well, verse 4 says that they all wanted to be one people. And at the time, they were all one people. That was sort of the purpose of all this. What were their materials? Well, it was bricks and asphalt, right? And they were going to be able to use those things to build this kingdom that reaches heaven. What was the type of kingdom they were trying to build? Well, obviously, it was a physical kingdom. And I do believe, however, it did have a religious perspective. It did have a religious undertone. You know, if you say, like, we're going to build a kingdom to reach heaven, well, certainly there is something religious about it. And if the historical information is right, that they already were building these giant mountain temples, well, it would seem that, yeah, this was something religious. But was this religious temple, was it a spiritual temple? No, they were building a physical temple or a physical city that had religious undertones. It was a physical kingdom. And of course, what was the purpose? I think I can pull this out of verse 4 again when it said they wanted to make a name for themselves. But they wanted to glorify themselves, right? Many of y'all, we've recently studied Ephesians 3. And there's the thought there in Ephesians 3:10 that the purpose of the church is to display the manifold wisdom of God to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. Something we talked about when we did the class about Ephesians 3 is that if you look at architecture, it's almost like when we look at a wonderful building and we praise the building, we go, wow, this is a nice structure. We really like this building. Who are we really glorifying? Are we glorifying the building? No, we're glorifying the builder, right? And it's the thing that the builder has produced that glorifies him. And in a similar way in 1 Corinthians 11, what glorifies God? Well, man glorifies God, right? Man is the glory of God. And through man, he built woman. So woman is the glory of man, thereby the glory of God. Because it's the things that he created that glorify him, right? So what's the purpose of these people getting together and building this giant mountain kingdom that reaches heaven? Is for them to be glorified. That people would look at it and go, wow, this is incredible. I can't believe they pulled this off. It's all about glorifying man. And I don't think it's weird to think that all powerful people through history, and if you talk to me in the foyer, I'll name a whole bunch of them for you, but all powerful men in history have all tried to build utopias. And in their mind, they just all try to build these grand, wonderful cities, and they make all these promises about these cities that, you know, there'll never be any crime, and there'll never be poor people, and the traffic, there'll be no such thing as traffic, everything will move slowly. That's always the mind of powerful men. They want to build these wonderful, perfect cities, but they never ever work out, right? Because they're all just an attempt to glorify man. And what was the plan? Well, the plan ultimately failed, just like every utopia has always failed, because it just doesn't simply work, right? Why don't we compare and contrast this to another kingdom? And of course, if this is the kingdom to reach heaven, what is the kingdom we're going to contrast this to? Could we contrast it to the kingdom of heaven? Because there's a lot of similarities here with this story. Who's the founder of the kingdom of heaven? Some of us would say Christ, which is the correct answer. But I'm going to go here for Genesis. I'm going to say it's Abraham. And it was founded there in chapter 12. I will make you a great nation, right? All the families of the earth shall be blessed through your seed. Who was the builder of the kingdom of heaven? Well, the builder was God. And I think Hebrews 11:10 says that very clearly, that Abraham and Sarah were looking for the city with foundations, whose builder and maker was God. That was the builder of this kingdom. What was the desire to build this kingdom? Well, God desired to make Abraham a great name. You remember this morning when we talked about when you're trying to pick your spot at the dinner table? Jesus says, we'll take a lowly place so the master can exalt you. Don't exalt yourself and then the master has to shut you down. What did Abraham do here? Abraham was in a humble position which allowed God to exalt him and make his name great. But the builders of the Tower of Babel, they tried to take the best seat on their own. They tried to exalt their own name. And what did God have to do? God had to humble them and make their plans fail. What was the language? Well, the Tower of Babel ended because the Lord changed their language. But the kingdom of heaven began because the Lord performed a language miracle in Acts 2. Have y'all ever wondered in Acts 2 on Pentecost why the Holy Spirit decided to reveal himself in that big, powerful way by working a language miracle? Where now all of a sudden all those people from their different native lands could hear the apostles teach in their own language. Have y'all ever wondered why he picked that miracle? Because I'll tell you what, I was a little kid and I was like, I'm not telling God that he did the wrong thing, but of all the powerful, incredible things God can do, why in the world did he pick a language miracle? I mean, I would have chose pillar of fire, right? Like I would have chosen I'll make everybody fly or something. Like I would have chosen anything else but a language miracle. But I can't help but think the answer is that we're supposed to see Pentecost as a parallel to the Tower of Babel, where he ended that kingdom with a language miracle, but he begins his kingdom with a language miracle as well. This language miracle did not scatter the people like the Tower of Babel. Instead, this language miracle brought all the people back. So it's almost like the Tower of Babel. What did God do? He scattered them. But with the language miracle in Acts 2, he brought everybody back. And now we can all be one people. But now we're going to be one people under God's terms. We're going to be one people in Christ, like Colossians 3 talks about. The materials of the Tower of Babel were bricks and asphalt. But the materials of the kingdom of heaven are living stones. Those are people, right? The kingdom of heaven does not come with observation. The kingdom of heaven is within you. The type of kingdom wasn't a physical kingdom, but it's a spiritual kingdom. In John 18, Jesus tells Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, my people would fight. But it is not of this world. The purpose of the kingdom to reach heaven was to glorify man. And the purpose of the kingdom of heaven is to glorify God, right? It's a totally different perspective. We've already talked about Ephesians 3. I think when we were all little in Bible class, if we got to be little in Bible class, I know that's a privilege. We got told or taught the Tower of Babel story. And we all sat there and we thought, those dummies. Like, what are they thinking? God told them to be fruitful and multiply, and they're all hanging out together thinking they're going to build some big old tower. Of course, God's going to mess it up for them. And we put ourselves in the shoes of these people, and we go, I would have never been there. I would have seen them work on that project and say, adios, and then laugh because they wouldn't know what that word meant, right? You know, like we tell ourselves if we were in the position of these people, we would never do. But you know, you can't help but think of Matthew 23 when Jesus makes fun of the Pharisees and he says the very same thing, that you wash the tombs of the prophets and you say, oh, if we lived in our father's day, we would have never done these things. And Jesus is like, yet you do those things every day. Do y'all do things to glorify yourself instead of glorify God? Do you lie sometimes to get out of something that you did? And you think, well, I did it, but if I just lied about it, that would help all this, smooth out of the way and we can forget about it. Are you selfish? Do you take things that are not yours because you want them and you think, well, no one will ever know and I can take this even though it doesn't belong to me and I'll be able to get this thing and enjoy this thing and there won't be any consequences? Do you commit fornication? Do you say, well, I want this person. This person wants me. Now, we don't have the right to each other. God hasn't given us the right to each other, but I want, so I'm going to take. Because that's what I want, right? Are we spitefully cruel to our brethren or our neighbors just because they offend us just a little bit? Instead of trying to be peacekeepers like the Lord told us to be peacekeepers? Have we glorified ourselves? You bet we all have glorified ourselves. When we glorify ourselves, where are we? We're sitting there right with them building the Tower of Babel, waiting on God to come up and mess up our plans to try to get us back on track. We're not near as good as we claim to be sometimes. But instead, if we can take a moment to reflect and learn from these stories, then we can make those choices to glorify God and sometimes choose the hard way because it's the right way. And when we choose the hard way because it's the right way, that's when we glorify God, and that's when we're building the kingdom of heaven. And that's where we all need to be. Ultimately, the plan to build the kingdom of heaven, did it work? Tower of Babel failed. But the kingdom of heaven has succeeded, and it continues to succeed every time someone comes and obeys the gospel. You know, if we covered all that, I forgot about one person. We haven't mentioned much about Japheth. What's interesting is that Noah prophesied that Japheth would return. We haven't read it, but in chapter 9, Noah curses Canaan because of something Ham did. And this is what's said in that prophecy/curse from Noah. He says in Genesis 9:26, Noah says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." You take this first part here, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." When was that fulfilled? When did Canaan become the servant of Shem? I know people have made this controversial before, but it's not controversial. Everyone who was in the Exodus generation knew the answer to that question. Canaan became a servant to Shem when Joshua invaded the promised land. And Joshua, the descendant of Shem, took Canaan's land and took Canaan's food and took Canaan's farms, and it became his stuff. And Canaan was prophesied to fall to Shem. That's when that happened, right? It was the invasion and conquest of the Canaan land. But here's verse 27. "May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." Well, wait, when did that happen? When did Japheth return to the tents of Shem? And now we have Shemites and Japhethites living together. Is that not saying when Jews and the father of all Gentiles here, Japheth, is that not saying when Jews and Gentiles come together and they live in the same tent, that's when those things will be fulfilled? Verse 27 says, "May God enlarge Japheth." What would we expect out of all the descendants of Japheth? Well, they would be the majority. They would be the largest. And I can tell you what, just basic little data, if you think about how many Jews there were in the world versus how many Gentiles there are in the world, well, there's always been a lot more Gentiles in the world than Jews. But the thought is these Gentiles will get to return and be in the tents of Shem. And I think that's fulfilled when the Gentiles are added to the church. If you remember the story of the centurion in Matthew 8, the centurion has a sick servant, and he calls to Jesus, and he asks for Jesus to come heal his servant. What is Jesus starting to do? Jesus is starting to walk to his house. But what does the centurion say? "Wait, Lord." He says, "I'm a commander. I have authority. I know you have authority. Lord, just say the word, and my servant will be healed." And Jesus does that, and he's so impressed of this Gentile's faith, Jesus marvels. And he says to those, "Surely I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." When will Japheth get to return? Japheth will get to return and sit with the descendants of Shem like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when we're all part of the church, our kingdom of heaven. That's when Japheth will get to return. And that was Noah's prophecy after the flood, that the Gentiles would be fellow heirs to the kingdom of heaven, right? Ultimately, here there's one more phrase that I think is tougher. "But concerning Japheth," at the end of verse 27, "and may Canaan be his servant." What am I supposed to do with that? Here's my best guess. Are y'all descendants of Japheth? Y'all all probably are. I'm sure Ham and Shem got around so much, we all probably have all three in us, I know. But still, if we're Gentiles, we consider ourselves to be descendants of Japheth. Do y'all sing songs about Canaan? As I'm putting my boys to sleep, we sing songs, something to keep Samuel to stop screaming. And often we'll sing, "We are bound for Canaan's land." Am I singing to my kids at night that we're all about to go take Canaan's land? I am. I am singing that. And you sing that too. We sing songs all the time about how we're bound for Canaan's land. And we're going to get Canaan's land. And we know those things aren't literal. But we, by joining the houses and the tents of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we've taken on this persona that Canaan is our servant. And that we too enjoy the blessings of God like when God gave Israelites the Canaan land. And I think there, in a sense, Canaan, who of course does not exist anymore, has figuratively become Japheth's servants. That Gentiles have adopted the persona of the invasion and conquest. And we sing about it and we talk about it to talk about the kingdom of heaven. Thank you for your close attention. If there's anyone here that needs to come into the tents of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the doors are opened up. And Jesus wants you to join the tents of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If there's anyone here that needs the prayers of the congregation, we also want to assist you with that. If either be your case, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.